Hey guys, welcome back. It's Miss Cassidus again, and this week we are going to be seeing a little bit of the first Americans and specifically the ancient American Indian civilization or culture. Now, our objective for this week is to summarize ancient Americans' migration and settlement, and also to identify civilizations that flourished throughout the Americas. Our I can statement is, I can tell how cultures varied widely among American Indian peoples. What is culture? Well, culture is the way of life of a group of people. That includes their language, even their hairstyle, different types of ceremonies, their clothing, and of course their art. Just like in Honduras, the different types of groups of people that live here have a flourished culture that varies depending on what region we live in. In the daily life for American Indians, it was different than what we are experiencing today. Adults would be busy with hunting, planting, gathering, making clothes, craft work, and even cooking, as you can see in the images that I've provided for you. Family roles. Much of American Indian life was based on traditions. Men and women had traditional roles. Children also had important roles in the family. In the American Indian religion, most of these groups had religious customs and traditions. Each American Indian group, tribe, and nation had its own religious beliefs. One thing that I found online, guys, and I found really interesting was this quote, "We will be known forever by the traces we leave," which is very true. You will be remembered by the way you lived your life while you were still in this world. Now, we are going to go straight to your textbook now. In your textbook, you'll find this on page 6. Now, we're going to begin with our vocabulary. We have migrate, hunter-gatherer, geography, climate, nomad, agriculture, technology, irrigation, and civilization. In our academic vocabulary, we have the words influence and distribute. People have lived on continents of North America and South America for thousands of years. Scientists and historians do not agree about when the first people arrived. They continue to study the past to learn more about this. However, many believe that the first people traveled from Asia to North America about 15,000 years ago. You can see an image of what that may look like. Early people arrive in Americas. Many scientists and historians agree that the first people arrived in North and South America over time and in several large groups. They have found evidence that early arrivals migrated or moved to the Americas in several different ways. Some early arrivals traveled by boat, while others traveled over land. Many of the first Americans may have crossed over to North America from Asia onto what is today the Bering Strait. A strait is a narrow body of water. The Bering Strait was not a narrow body of water thousands of years ago when some of the first Americans may have crossed it. It was a dry bridge of land that people today call Beringia. Thousands of years ago, the temperature was very cold, much colder than today. There were thick sheets of ice that covered much of the land. Many scientists and historians think that the first people crossed the land bridge from Asia because they were tracking animals to hunt. They lived in North America as hunter-gatherers, traveling from place to place in search of animals to hunt, fish to catch, and fruit and nuts to collect. Now, by looking at this map, you guys are going to do your reading check. It says, describe the directions of the routes and analyze why people might have migrated those directions. Using resources to live. Over thousands of years, people moved to different areas of North and South America to live. They found that geography, or the land of bodies of water of a place, varied. The climate, or the weather in a place over time, was also different in each region. Often the geography and climate influenced where people decided to settle and how they would use the resources of that area. Resources are distributed differently across continents. They also affect how people live with what they use to build their homes, what they eat, the clothing they wear, and the tools they create. For those of you that may be wondering, influence means to help produce an effect, and distribute means to spread out. Areas with mountains are often colder and wetter than low-lying areas with dry and hot deserts. They have different resources, but both areas pose different challenges. People had to adapt or adjust to the environment in order to live in it. Sometimes they had to modify it or even change it. Early people were hunter-gatherers and often roamed a region in search of food. They were known as nomads, which are people who move within a specific region to follow herds of animals and to collect food. When people began practicing agriculture about 10,000 years ago, they modified their environment. Agriculture is the practice of planting and raising food. People who were living in it was present-day Mexico were the first farmers in North America. The area where they lived was dry and hot. They needed to bring water for nearby rivers to their crops. This kind of technology, or the use of scientific knowledge or tools to do the work, is called irrigation. Groups that farmed stayed in one place. Indian groups in the southwest and east of Mississippi built permanent settlements and often built their villages in areas that were near water. Some groups on the large flat grasslands of the Great Plains were nomads, while others established villages and farmed the rich soil near rivers. All plain groups depended on the buffalo as their primary source. So here you can see of the lifestyles of an ancient American peoples. You've got the nomadic, which were the people that constantly moved around, and the stationary. They were hunting and gathering, while the stationary had their own food that they grew. Limited agriculture, but this one had limited hunting and gathering. The nomadics had limited fishing, but the stationary had permanent fishing. And the nomadic had no irrigation systems, meanwhile the stationary did. Here we have a second reading check. Explain how geography and climate affected the resources that American Indian groups used. Now, we come to the Mayan and Aztec civilization, where agriculture developed. It helped to feed more people and populations began to grow. Growing settlements needed rules for living together and making decisions that affected everyone. Eventually, something called a civilization developed. In civilizations, there are organized systems of government, religion, and learning. As the image you can see here, the Aztecs' floating gardens, called chinampas, provided most of the food for the people of Tenochtitlan. Reading, describe to a partner how the picture of the Aztec floating garden shows people modifying the environment. You can explain this, you could ask and do this activity with your parents. Central America was home to advanced civilizations, including the Maya and later the Aztec. The Maya rose about 30,500 years ago. They developed a writing system, made a very accurate calendar, charted movements of the moon and stars, and even created a system for advanced math. Yet Mayan civilization faded by about the year 900. Aztec civilization began to thrive throughout southern Mexico and Central America. The Aztec built their main city center in what is today Mexico City. It was called Tenochtitlan. Hundreds of thousands of people lived there at one point. The Aztec modified their environment in order to live in it. Beds were made of reeds, tall grasses that grew in lakes, and they built floating gardens as we saw in the picture above. There were other North American groups as well. We had someone called the Mound Builders who developed a civilization that started around the Ohio River. You also have the ancestral Puebloans who first appeared about 2,000 years ago in the states of Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, also Utah. And of course, they had to adapt to their environment. These North American groups and later American Indian nations such as the Iroquois, Huron, Cherokee, Navajo, Creek, Hopi, Algonquin, and Lakota, are also known as the Sioux, adapted to their environment. Many modified its needs to survive and to support their ways of life. The Chumash, who lived in the present-day Southern California, used fire to burn shrubs and grassland. When they cleared the land, they could better hunt such animals as deers. Now, here's a reading check. You're going to compare and contrast two different groups of the American Indians, which are the Calusa and the Chumash. Remember that this is a Venn diagram. On the outside of the independent circles, you're going to put the differences, and in the center, you will be putting the similarities. Now, when we see each other again, I'll have a little more info to give you guys, which is going to be right now, actually. There's a video on builders in stone, so please pay attention.
Finding food, water, and shelter is something every culture relies on for survival. This is as true in your community today as it was hundreds of years ago. Today, December is going to explore an ancient culture found in southwest Colorado.
My name's December and this is my story.
Here at Mesa Verde National Park, you can get a great glimpse of what life might have been like hundreds of years ago. Located in the mountainous regions of southwest Colorado, this area was once home to the ancient Puebloans, or Anasazi. As we take our tour today, you will find that this national park is filled with pieces of the past. December and her father have traveled from New Mexico to meet with Park Ranger Linda. She is going to guide them on a fascinating tour of the ruins.
This is a pit house. It shows the early days of living here and starting about 600 AD. And you've got the fire pit. You've got your posters to bring your uprights so you can put some headspace in it. That would all be covered with plaster with just a hole down through the top.
Digging out these pit houses must have taken a long time. As time went on, the ancient Puebloans began building up instead of digging down. Their community was growing and they needed new, safer ways to provide shelter.
Here's where we have one of the original villages. It only has one row of stones that make the walls, not only in between the rooms, but on the outside. So it's called one-course masonry, and it's called a village. The word Pueblo means village in Spanish, and because it's all connected together. Does it remind you of a modern-day apartment house?
Mm-hmm.
As these ancient people grew up out of their pit houses and into their above-ground pueblos, the pit houses took on many uses.
What are the kivas for?
The kiva is a Hopi word for room underneath. They were ceremonial areas. They would have all been roofed over, and they would have been used for seasonal ceremonies, for rites of passage, for curing ceremonies.
The ancient Puebloans continued to develop their skills and found ways to shape the world around them. Perhaps the most impressive showing of how they did this is at one of Mesa Verde's most treasured places.
And here we see the palace in a cliff.
Cool.
The Anasazi were incredibly resourceful in their environment. Building into the cliffs for shelter while using the land above for farming was ingenious. December finds all this pretty amazing and takes time to admire the ancient dwellings in the park. Mesa Verde has over 300 cliff dwellings that showcase how these ancient people once lived. Archaeologists believe they moved into the cliff dwellings around 1100 AD. These stone towns feature storage space, work areas for preparing food and clothing, fire pits for cooking, and kivas for special celebrations.
In most of the rooms, they would have stored ceremonial objects, seeds for the next planting season, dried corn, dried beans, and squash that's dried. Well, what do you think it would have been like to live here 1,000 years ago?
Probably have to look for food every day.
Every day. And in the winter, it would be almost impossible. But so we'd have to do a lot of looking,
Yeah.
especially in the spring and the fall.
The Anasazi picked berries from the trees. They grew crops like corn and maize, and they used the rain and natural springs for hydration. They used their surrounding environment in nearly every way they could. December is simply amazed with Mesa Verde National Park, and she wants to make sure that places like this are around for generations to come.
Thanks for coming to Mesa Verde.
Yeah, thank you.
As her journey draws to a close, December realizes how the places we live in also shape how we live. The Puebloans were able to use their environment to provide food, shelter, and sustain their community for nearly 1,000 years. That's pretty amazing.
I enjoyed this adventure today and I learned a lot.
Okay, well, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I have another one. It's on the power of geography, but I'm going to leave it for next week. And I have one more thing that I'd like to show you guys. We're going to be taking a virtual tour of one of the Aztec temples, which we will be discussing by asking some true and false questions based on what we read, and also some open-ended questions. So I hope you guys will enjoy the class next week. Can't wait to see you. Have a great day. Bye.